But let's discuss. We are joined by CNN legal analyst, former federal prosecutor Laura Coates, and CNN senior media correspondent, host of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter. You know, Brian, there was an assault on the media this weekend. The president had a speech in Harrisburg. The first 12 minutes of this big speech was all about the media. His chief of staff goes on TV the next day and says, you know what, we've looked into changing the libel laws here. You know, they picked the media as an enemy here. Indeed.
Attack the messenger is a time-honored strategy going back to the Trump campaign, really going back to the 1970s in Republican politics. But this president does it like no one we've ever seen on the public stage before. There is a venom to it, as Carl Bernstein said. We can talk about that later. But this libel law issue, it is continuing to keep the door open to the threat of making it easier to sue news organizations for what they report.
Laura, you don't just have a federal libel law that he can try to do away with. You got to change the Constitution. You have to amend the Constitution, or go to the states, which is very tricky because they have their own individual libel laws. And I should note, the Obama administration was not, is not a glowing example of how to treat the media, right? I mean, they used existing laws like the Espionage Act to silence the media, to go after them, but legally, what could happen here? Do they have any power?
Well, talking about with Reince Priebus saying he looked at the libel laws, I'm assuming he read just the First Amendment, which would be a huge roadblock to any of this. Remember, every single state has a different libel law, and in order for Congress, a body that has authority over federal laws, would have to actually either every state change it or pass a federal libel law. Even if they were able to do that, the First Amendment for the last 50 years in the Supreme Court, there's very clear precedent that says, look, especially for a public figure, you have an actual malice standard. Very, very hard to prove. It means I had to know it was false, and I had to disregard that likelihood. So for this to actually change legally, have to take monumental efforts to do so. But, Poppy, you're absolutely right. The Espionage Act is going to be the way that if POTUS, the President of the United States, does do this, he'll have to go through. Remember, that says that if you divulge national security related information, you can be held accountable. So enter here journalists who either fail to divulge their sources or publish or print articles that actually divulge national security information. That's how you can still punish the media without altering the First Amendment.
And so far, we've not seen that happen. All we've seen from this administration is huffing and puffing, threats to press freedom that are only verbal, not actual action. We haven't seen anything actually done yet. Hopefully, that's all it becomes.
You had an interesting discussion about this, Brian, with a guy who knows a little something about journalism and about official pressure on journalists. That's Carl Bernstein, formerly the Washington Post, now CNN commentator, the Watergate guy. Let's listen to what Carl said.
This is part of an attitude, regardless of whether they're really going to seek such a change. And the attitude was expressed in Trump's speech last night, which is the most venomous speech by an American president that I have heard in more than 50 years of reporting. Venomous towards the press, venomous towards legitimate political opponents, and it was a roadmap of a venomous state of mind.
I get the sense that Carl didn't like the speech, Brian.
I think he was expressing what a lot of folks in the press might want to say, which is when you're up at a podium degrading real news outlets like CNN as fake news, it does have long-term consequences. It does, over the long term, affect people's perceptions of where they can get real information, where they can get the truth. President Trump sometimes suggests everything could be true, which sort of implies nothing is known to be true, that you can choose your own set of facts. And at that rally, some of his misstatements about the media and other issues just reinforce that perception. So I think when Carl Bernstein says venomous, that's what he means. It has these long-term repercussions of these words.
Very quickly, Laura, there were some signals from Justice Gorsuch's hearings around his confirmation that signaled he's not on the same the same page as the president when it comes to this.
Exactly right. And we're talking about that actual malice standard where you have to know that it was false and you disregarded the likelihood that it was actually false when you published it. When Justice Gorsuch, then Judge Gorsuch, was asked about the question, he said he cited an appellate decision that he had made himself where he essentially said the same thing, that standard still remains true. And it's not about whether it is specifically false. It's about whether it was substantially true. A very good signal that we have a justice in the Supreme Court who remains close to the New York Sullivan standard, which is a very bad sign for opening up any libel law.
Guys, thank you very much. Brian Stelter, Laura Coates, we appreciate it.